September 6, 1945. Aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Glory, Japanese commanders Hitoshi Imamura and Jinichi Kusaka surrender the mighty fortress of Rabaul. When Australian forces finally step ashore, they expect to find the starving, broken remnants of a garrison choked by a devastating Allied blockade. Instead, they uncover a staggering reality. Beneath the bombed-out surface lies a fully functioning underground metropolis. Nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors are still there, alive, heavily armed, and waiting. How did a military force the size of a city survive completely cut off from their empire for a year and a half? And why did the Allies never actually have to fight them? What the Australians were looking at wasn't just a stranded outpost. The forces garrisoned at Rabaul represented one of the largest and most formidable concentrations of Japanese military might in the entire Pacific. This was a war machine built for conquest. Yet by early 1944, it had simply been erased from the strategic map. For 18 months, right up until the Emperor's capitulation, this colossal army existed in a state of absolute, suffocating isolation. Above ground, they were subjected to relentless, daily Allied air raids that systematically vaporized their infrastructure. The sea lanes were violently severed. Not a single cargo ship could break the blockade. No external food, no medicine, no reinforcements. By every conventional rule of siege warfare, a trapped population of this magnitude should have collapsed. It should have ended in catastrophic mass starvation, rampant disease, or a chaotic, suicidal final stand. Instead, it remained completely intact. This is the great, overlooked paradox of the Pacific Theater. How did an isolated military organization of nearly 100,000 men manage to feed and sustain itself under a daily rain of high explosives? And why did the advancing Allied command deliberately choose to leave one of the most dangerous armies on the planet sitting untouched in their rear? To understand how this impossible survival was engineered, we have to go back to the exact moment the steel trap snapped shut. February 1944. February 1944 marked the exact moment the strategic geometry of the Pacific fundamentally shifted. For 2 years, Rabaul had been the undisputed, beating heart of the Japanese war machine in the South Pacific. Sitting on the northeastern tip of New Britain, its deep-water anchorages at Simpson Harbor had launched the fleets that threatened Australia, while its airfields dominated the skies over New Guinea and the Solomons. But the Allied command, led by General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral William Halsey, recognized that a direct amphibious assault on this heavily fortified stronghold would result in a staggering bloodbath. So, they changed the rules of the game. Through Operation Cartwheel, the Allies spent months systematically capturing the islands surrounding Rabaul, severing its supply lines, and building a ring of forward air bases that tightened around the garrison like a noose. The final blow to Rabaul's offensive capability came in the third week of February. After a series of devastating carrier strikes and land-based bomber raids, the Japanese High Command looked at the burning wreckage of their squadrons and made a fateful decision. The last surviving naval aircraft were abruptly withdrawn to Truk Lagoon. In a matter of days, the skies above New Britain were completely surrendered to the Allies. Simultaneously, the waters around the island became a killing zone. Allied submarines, PT boats, and low-level bombers prowled the approaches, turning Simpson Harbor into a graveyard of twisted metal and sunken transport ships. The mighty fortress was effectively neutralized. The sea lanes were dead. The airspace was hostile. The trap had snapped shut. But there is a widespread misconception about what happened next. Bypassing Rabaul did not mean the Allies simply ignored it and moved on. On the contrary, the fortress became the primary target for one of the most concentrated, relentless aerial punishment campaigns in history. Knowing that an immense concentration of Japanese troops remained entrenched on the island, the Allied air forces used Rabaul as a permanent live-fire training ground. Day after day, week after week, Swarms of B-24 Liberators, B-25 Mitchells, and Marine Corsairs swept over the volcanic caldera. They dropped thousands of tons of high explosives, incendiaries, and fragmentation bombs. The objective was simple: keep the giant pinned down, destroy its infrastructure, and bleed it dry. Above ground, the results were apocalyptic. The bustling colonial town of Rabaul, with its barracks, warehouses, and administrative buildings, was physically erased from the map. The surface became a pulverized moonscape of craters, shattered palm trees, and burning debris. To stand above ground during daylight was practically a death sentence. Faced with total annihilation from the air, the commanders of the 8th Area Army, General Hitoshi Imamura, and the Southeastern Fleet, Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, realized that the surface of the Earth was no longer habitable. If their colossal army was to survive the daily rain of explosives, it had to disappear. And so, an entire military organization, infantry divisions, artillery regiments, naval mechanics, and administrative staffs picked up shovels, pickaxes, and bayonets and began to dig. The geography of Rabaul offered one crucial advantage. The area was highly volcanic, bordered by active craters, and the surrounding hills were composed of soft, tightly packed pumice and volcanic ash. It was relatively easy to excavate, but structurally sound enough to hold up without extensive timber reinforcements. What started as desperate foxholes and shallow slit trenches rapidly evolved into an astonishing feat of subterranean engineering. The Japanese garrison carved out a staggering network of over 300 miles of interlocking tunnels, caves, and subterranean bunkers. Photographs captured by the Australians at the end of the war reveal a surreal, almost impossible reality hidden beneath the jungle floor. Vast underground hospitals were constructed, complete with hundreds of wooden beds neatly lined up along the curved, rock-hewn walls. Surgical theaters operated under the glow of jury-rigged wiring, safely insulated from the shockwaves of 2,000-pound bombs detonating above. Massive caverns were excavated to serve as impenetrable ammunition dumps, where artillery shells, small arms, and even torpedoes were stacked floor to ceiling in the damp gloom. Entire command centers operated deep underground, where staff officers sat at wooden desks beneath dirt ceilings, tracing maps by the flicker of diesel generators and candlelight. Deep subterranean barracks housed thousands of men, connected by a labyrinth of narrow corridors reeking of sulfur, engine exhaust, and stagnant air. The sheer physical scale of this survival effort was unprecedented. Nearly 100,000 human beings had successfully retreated into the earth, sheltering in the dark while the surface of their island was systematically blown to dust. But going underground solved only the immediate problem of high explosives. It created a far more insidious and inescapable threat. When the garrison abandoned the surface, they dragged whatever remaining stockpiles of rice, canned meat, and medical supplies they could salvage into the dark with them. But those stockpiles were finite, and the clock was ticking. An army of this magnitude consumes a massive amount of calories every single day just to exist. And the sea lanes were completely, permanently severed. There were no cargo ships on the horizon. There were no transport planes in the sky. Tens of thousands of men were now trapped in a dark, claustrophobic maze, listening to the muffled thud of daily bombing raids, living on the absolute certainty of diminishing rations. The bombs couldn't reach them, but starvation could. It is one thing to survive a bombardment by hiding in a cave. It is an entirely different logistical nightmare to sustain a population the size of a small city beneath the ground. If normal military operations are driven entirely into the dirt, and the ocean is controlled by an enemy that shoots anything that floats, how do you supply food, medicine, and the basic necessities of life to 100,000 people when the empire completely stops calling? The blunt answer to that question was something no commander in the Imperial Japanese forces wanted to admit. You don't. By the spring of 1944, General Hitoshi Imamura and Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka had to look at the cold, unforgiving mathematics of their situation. They commanded nearly 100,000 mouths, and the daily caloric burn of that massive population was chewing through their subterranean warehouses at a terrifying rate. Every sack of rice, every tin of meat, and every barrel of preserved rations dragged down into the caves was now a finite resource that would never be replaced. For months, standard military doctrine and the ingrained pride of the Imperial Armed Forces dictated that the garrison hold the line and wait for relief. The psychological anchor for the men sitting in the dark was the belief that the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet would eventually smash through the Allied blockade and relieve the fortress. But Imamura, a highly pragmatic officer, saw the reality written in the empty skies and the silent radios. The fleet was never coming back. The garrison had been strategically written off. If the army simply sat in their caves and strictly rationed their remaining supplies, they would not die in the glorious, defiant final stand on the beaches. They would slowly, pathetically starve to death in the dirt. Facing the total collapse of his command, Imamura issued a radical directive that fundamentally altered the purpose of one of the most lethal military concentrations in the Pacific. To survive the blockade, the 8th Area Army and the Southeastern Fleet had to stop acting like an army and a navy. They had to become a farming workforce. The psychological shock of this transition was profound. These were men who had been intensely drilled for brutal infantry assaults, complex naval maneuvers, and the maintenance of cutting-edge fighter aircraft. They were proud warriors of an expanding empire. Now, the chain of command was ordering elite naval infantry, seasoned artillery crews, and aviation mechanics to lay down their Arisaka rifles and pick up hoes, shovels, and improvised agricultural tools. Because the daylight hours were dominated by the relentless roar of Allied bombers, the garrison had to adapt to a bizarre nocturnal rhythm. Under the cover of darkness, or during the brief, tense windows of silence between air raids, thousands of soldiers crept out of the subterranean labyrinth. They stepped out onto a pulverized, cratered wasteland, littered with unexploded ordnance and twisted shrapnel. Using scavenged metal and broken vehicle parts shaped into makeshift machetes and spades, infantrymen began to hack away at the thick jungle creeping back over the volcanic slopes. They cleared away the debris of their shattered base to expose the rich, dark volcanic soil beneath. They terraced the hillsides, dug irrigation trenches, and prepared the ground. What began as a desperate, humiliating pivot from combat to manual labor quickly became a frantic race against the clock. Every day that passed brought their underground food reserves closer to absolute zero. They were no longer fighting the Americans or the Australians. They were fighting the inevitable mathematics of their own starvation. And as the first seeds were pushed into the volcanic ash, what started as a desperate scramble for survival was about to evolve into something entirely unprecedented in the history of modern siege warfare. The blunt answer to that question was something no commander in the Imperial Japanese forces wanted to admit. You don't. By the spring of 1944, General Hitoshi Imamura and Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka had to look at the cold, unforgiving mathematics of this situation. They commanded nearly 100,000 mouths, and the daily caloric burn of that massive population was chewing through their subterranean warehouses at a terrifying rate. Every sack of rice, every tin of meat, and every barrel of preserved rations dragged down into the caves was now a finite resource that would never be replaced. For months, standard military doctrine and the ingrained pride of the Imperial Armed Forces dictated that the garrison hold the line and wait for relief. The psychological anchor for the men sitting in the dark was the belief that the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet would eventually smash through the Allied blockade and relieve the fortress. But Imamura, a highly pragmatic officer, saw the reality written in the empty skies and the silent radios. The fleet was never coming back. The garrison had been strategically written off, If the army simply sat in their caves and strictly rationed their remaining supplies, they would not die in a glorious, defiant final stand on the beaches. They would slowly, pathetically starve to death in the dirt. Facing the total collapse of his command, Imamura issued a radical directive that fundamentally altered the purpose of one of the most lethal military concentrations in the Pacific. To survive the blockade, the 8th Area Army and the Southeastern Fleet had to stop acting like an army and a navy. They had to become a farming workforce. The psychological shock of this transition was profound. These were men who had been intensely drilled for brutal infantry assaults, complex naval maneuvers, and the maintenance of cutting-edge fighter aircraft. They were proud warriors of an expanding empire, raised on a strict martial code. Now, the chain of command was ordering elite naval infantry, seasoned artillery crews, and aviation mechanics to lay down their Arisaka rifles and pick up hoes, shovels, and improvised agricultural tools. But transitioning from combat to farming on a massive scale is not merely a matter of handing a rifleman a spade. It requires the total re-engineering of a military society. Initially, the desperate, disorganized planting around the mouths of the tunnels yielded erratic and disastrous results. Imamura quickly realized that simply ordering exhausted soldiers to scratch at the dirt and scatter seeds would not prevent mass starvation. If nearly 100,000 men were going to survive complete isolation, agriculture had to be managed with the exact same ruthless, mathematical precision as a major amphibious invasion. Inside the damp, dimly lit subterranean command bunkers deep beneath the Pumice Hills, the brightest logistical minds of the Japanese 8th Area Army were completely repurposed. Officers who had previously spent their days calculating artillery trajectories, aviation fuel consumption, and complex fleet maneuvers were suddenly handed an entirely different set of variables. They were forced to become agricultural planners. Today, preserved in the archives of the Australian War Memorial, you can find the actual surviving documents from this surreal period. They are not battle plans or defense schematics. They are meticulously drafted agricultural spreadsheets, hand-drawn by imperial staff officers. These documents reveal a staggering level of bureaucratic obsession. The Japanese command calculated the exact daily caloric intake required to keep an infantryman physically capable of fighting off an invasion. They cross-referenced this biological minimum against the expected crop yields of different root vegetables planted in volcanic soil. They mathematically determined the precise square footage of arable land that needed to be cleared, terraced, and cultivated per man to sustain the entire garrison indefinitely. The entire military hierarchy was violently rewired to support this singular objective. Elite infantry divisions were assigned strict quotas not for enemy kills or miles advanced, but for sweet potato and cassava harvests. Battalions were held strictly accountable for their agricultural output, with officers facing severe reprimands if their yields fell short of the spreadsheets. The Quartermaster Corps, once responsible for distributing incoming Empire supplies from the massive cargo ships in Simpson Harbor, now acted as an internal, subterranean commodities market. They tracked the flow of eggplant, tapioca, taro, and greens from the hidden volcanic terraces down into the underground warehouses. Because regular rice cultivation was impossible on the required scale in Rabaul's terrain, the entire cultural diet of the Japanese force had to be radically altered, replacing their staple food with unfamiliar local root crops. The staff officers were essentially running a highly regulated command economy from inside a cave system, fighting a war of spreadsheets against their own biological clocks. But a massive agricultural revolution requires tools, and the Allied blockade had severed the supply of basic equipment just as effectively as it had cut off the food. You cannot farm on an industrial scale without hoes, spades, sickles, and plows. The imperial supply ships of 1942 and 1943 had brought heavy artillery, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and aviation parts. They had certainly not brought tens of thousands of farming implements to a frontline combat zone. The solution lay in the garrison's highly trained technical personnel. Deep beneath the earth, safe from the 2,000-pound bombs detonating on the surface, the vast subterranean workshops of the naval aviation mechanics and motorized transport battalions were completely transformed. These were highly skilled men who had been trained to overhaul the complex, precision-machined radial engines of Mitsubishi Zero fighters, or repair the delicate optics of naval rangefinders. Now, their machine shops and forges, ventilated by makeshift chimneys carefully carved through the rock, were turned toward a completely new kind of war production. Using the only abundant resources left on the island, the wreckage of their own shattered infrastructure, and the metal falling from the sky, they began to manufacture an entire agricultural arsenal. Mechanics dragged pieces of destroyed aircraft, blown-out transport trucks, and jagged, heavy shrapnel from Allied bombs down into the sweltering tunnels. In these dark, sulfurous caverns, working by the light of scavenged engine oil lamps, they melted down aircraft-grade aluminum, forged steel, and hammered scrap iron into thousands of custom-made farming implements. A piece of fuselage from a downed American B-24 Liberator was heated and bent into a plowshare. The heavy leaf springs of a ruined Japanese staff car were sharpened and tempered into heavy machetes for clearing the dense jungle. Even the unexploded Allied bombs were carefully diffused by engineering units, not just to save lives, but to harvest the high-quality casing steel for shovels. This underground industrial base didn't stop at simple tools. The sheer scale of the subterranean city required constant, frantic maintenance to prevent cave-ins, flooding, and the rapid spread of disease. Specialized engineering units operated massive, jury-rigged ventilation systems using salvaged aircraft motors to pump breathable air into tunnels packed tightly with thousands of sweating men. Vast underground hospitals, some capable of holding thousands of patients at a time, were kept running by medical officers who distilled their own anesthetics from fermented organic matter and sterilized surgical instruments using boiling water over smokeless charcoal fires. Every single piece of equipment, every scrap of canvas, and every strand of copper wire was endlessly recycled, repurposed, and repaired. As standard-issue uniforms rotted away in the damp, abrasive environment of the pumice tunnels, soldiers patched their clothing with parachute silk, burlap sacks, or anything they could scavenge. The visual reality of a Japanese soldier in Rabaul became a stark contradiction. A man dressed in patched rags, holding a hand-forged farming hoe, but with a meticulously cleaned and oiled Arisaka rifle slung across his back. Above ground, the physical landscape of Rabaul underwent a bizarre and highly camouflaged metamorphosis. The cratered wasteland left by the bombers was slowly, methodically transformed into a sprawling terraced farm. But simple carbohydrates like sweet potatoes and cassava were not enough to sustain a fighting force long term. A human body performing heavy manual labor requires protein, vitamins, and, most crucially, salt. The Japanese military organization tackled each of these biological necessities with clinical efficiency. To secure protein, they organized large-scale livestock operations. Pigs and chickens, originally brought to the island in small numbers or scavenged from the surrounding native environment, were bred in heavily concealed pens constructed beneath the thickest parts of the jungle canopy. Veterinary officers established strict breeding programs, carefully monitoring the health of the animals and severely rationing the feed, which was meticulously compiled from the scraps, peels, and refuse of the human population. The problem of salt was far more complex, but equally vital. Without salt, a human body forced to perform heavy manual labor in the crushing tropical heat of the South Pacific will rapidly succumb to severe muscle cramps, debilitating dehydration, and eventual organ failure. With Empire shipments gone forever, the garrison turned to the Bismarck Sea. Specialized details were assigned to the dangerous coastal fringes of the island. They engineered massive seawater evaporation and boiling facilities. Because a column of smoke would immediately attract the attention of Allied patrol planes, these facilities were heavily camouflaged, and the boiling was done using carefully constructed fires that minimized smoke output, often burning only at night or during heavy rainstorms. They pumped seawater into massive iron cauldrons, often salvaged from the rusting hulks of destroyed transport ships sitting in Simpson Harbor, and boiled it down using timber harvested under the cover of darkness. This desperate, incredibly labor-intensive process produced enough pure sea salt to keep the entire garrison's metabolism functioning. Water supply presented another massive logistical hurdle. The relentless daily bombing often shattered the natural watersheds, caused landslides that blocked streams, and contaminated surface water with explosives and debris. In response, Japanese engineers sank deep artesian wells directly from inside their tunnel networks, boring down through the volcanic rock to tap into underground aquifers. They constructed elaborate bamboo aqueducts and sand filtration systems to channel fresh, clean water directly into the subterranean barracks. The garrison was no longer just hiding. They were engineering a completely self-sufficient, closed-loop ecosystem surviving entirely within a ring of Allied steel. But none of this was peaceful. The Rabaul agricultural complex was operated under the constant, terrifying shadow of immediate death. The Allied air forces never stopped coming. The command in the Southwest Pacific used the bypassed fortress as a permanent live-fire training ground for new squadrons. Every single day, the skies above New Britain roared with the engines of Mitchell's Liberators and Corsairs, scanning the ground for any sign of life, any target of opportunity, any hint that the enemy was still functioning. Sometimes they dropped delayed fuse bombs designed to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating, intentionally trying to collapse the tunnel networks and crush the men inside. Because the surface was a designated kill zone during daylight hours, the vast majority of this massive farming operation had to be conducted in the dark. As the sun set and the Allied planes returned to their bases, the subterranean city emptied out. Tens of thousands of heavily armed soldiers emerged from the suffocating earth, moving silently through the humid jungle. By moonlight, they weeded the sweet potato fields, harvested crops, hauled heavy buckets of water, and desperately repaired the irrigation trenches damaged by the day's bombing. It was a grueling, surreal existence that stretched the limits of human endurance. An infantryman might spend 12 hours in pitch blackness, breathing stale, sulfurous air in a crowded tunnel, listening to the earth physically shake from high explosives detonating directly above him. Then, as night fell, he would crawl out of the earth, pick up a hoe forged from airplane scrap, and spend the next 8 hours breaking his back in the suffocating tropical heat. He was desperately trying to grow enough food to survive the week, always scanning the dark sky, listening for the distant, terrifying drone of a night-harassing Allied bomber. What kept this absurd, desperate system from completely collapsing into mutiny or chaos was the iron-fisted enforcement of Imperial Japanese military discipline. This was not a commune of desperate survivors. It remained a highly structured, exceptionally lethal military force. General Imamura and his staff understood that if military discipline broke down, if the men began to steal food, refuse labor, or lose their cohesion, the entire fragile ecosystem would shatter overnight. The chain of command remained absolute. To maintain morale, Imamura himself cultivated a small garden patch outside his command bunker, demonstrating to his officers that manual labor was not beneath their dignity. Punishments for hoarding rations, stealing from the communal gardens, or sleeping during agricultural shifts were severe, swift, and brutal. The soldiers were constantly drilled. Their weapons were meticulously cleaned, oiled, and inspected in the damp tunnels. Their combat readiness was fiercely maintained. The officers constantly reminded the men that their ultimate purpose was not to be a peasant workforce, but to defend the island to the very last man when the inevitable Allied amphibious invasion finally came. They were farmers only so they could live long enough to die as soldiers. While this extraordinary society fought for its life in the dirt, a completely different reality existed thousands of feet above them. From the cockpits of the Allied B-25 Mitchells, banking over the caldera, and in the reconnaissance photographs laid out on intelligence desks in Brisbane and Washington, the situation at Rabaul looked like a textbook, undeniable success of modern siege warfare. The Allied crews flying over the fortress saw exactly what they expected to see, and exactly what their strategy was designed to produce. They saw a pulverized, lifeless moonscape. They saw the skeletal, burning remains of colonial barracks, the shattered concrete docks, and the sunken ships rusting in the harbor. They saw a landscape effectively bombed back to the Stone Age. When reconnaissance cameras occasionally spotted small patches of cultivated land in the jungle, intelligence officers quickly dismissed them. They assumed these were the desperate, meager scratchings of a dying, broken garrison attempting to stave off the inevitable. Allied intelligence officers analyzed the sheer volume of high explosives dropped on the island. They factored in the complete severing of Japanese supply lines, the destruction of the barges, and the sinking of the transport submarines. They fed this data into their own calculations and drew the only logical conclusion. The blockade was suffocating the Japanese. The official intelligence reports confidently asserted that the massive garrison must be suffering from widespread, catastrophic starvation, rampant malaria, dysentery, and entirely collapsing morale. The Allies firmly believed that the remaining Japanese forces were slowly wasting away in the dark, reduced to a hollow shell of desperate, diseased men who would soon pose virtually no threat to anyone. They completely, fundamentally underestimated their enemy's capacity to adapt. The Allies had successfully isolated Rabaul, cutting it off from the Empire and pinning it down with air power. But they had failed to understand the psychological and organizational resilience of the trapped army. Allied command was looking exclusively at the ruined surface, entirely blind to the meticulously organized, highly disciplined society thriving just below the jungle canopy and deep within the volcanic rock. They believed they were watching an army slowly die. Unaware, they were actually bombing a highly functioning, self-sustaining city. By the time 1944 rolled into 1945, the unthinkable had happened. Against all conventional military logic, against the immense weight of the Allied blockade, the Japanese 8th Area Army had stabilized its freefall. The massive, meticulously planned harvests of sweet potatoes, taro, and cassava began to come in, filling the subterranean storehouses exactly as the staff officers' spreadsheets had predicted. The daily caloric intake of the soldiers stopped dropping and leveled out at a bare but entirely sustainable rate. The underground hospitals successfully managed disease. The subterranean workshops continued to churn out tools and maintain the infrastructure. The livestock reproduced. The salt evaporation pans provided the necessary minerals. The Japanese command had achieved the impossible. They had successfully transformed one of the most lethal, complex military bases in the Pacific Theater into a small, fiercely independent, subterranean nation-state. They were no longer slowly dying in the dark. They were surviving, sustaining themselves through sheer, disciplined willpower and unprecedented organizational genius. With the garrison achieving an astonishing level of food independence, it appeared that the entire Allied strategy of starving them into submission had completely, spectacularly failed. The Allies had designed a blockade to starve Rabaul into a graveyard, but they vastly underestimated the sheer bureaucratic willpower of the Imperial Japanese Army. Years later, a post-war Japanese staff officer reflecting on this period made a stunning comparison. Rabaul had effectively ceased to be a military base and had become a small, fiercely independent country. They possessed their own self-sustaining agriculture, an internal economy, a functioning medical system, and a heavily armed populace. Against all conventional logic, they had completely beaten the starvation blockade. But this astonishing logistical triumph masked a fatal strategic trap. As 1944 bled into 1945, the front line of the Pacific War moved with terrifying speed. American amphibious armadas were tearing through the Marianas, landing in the Philippines, and preparing to strike at Okinawa and Iwo Jima. In those critical battles, Imperial commanders were desperately begging Tokyo for reinforcements. They were fighting to the last man, bleeding out on foreign beaches for lack of reserves. Which raises an obvious, glaring question. If General Imamura had nearly 100,000 disciplined, well-fed, and heavily armed troops just sitting in New Britain, why didn't Japan simply evacuate them and deploy them where the empire actually needed them? The answer lies in the cold, mechanical reality of industrial warfare. A massive army is only an asset if you can physically move it. To successfully extract nearly 100,000 men from Rabaul, the Imperial Japanese Navy would have needed to assemble a colossal armada of slow, vulnerable transport ships. That fleet would then have to sail thousands of miles across an ocean completely dominated by American submarines, while requiring absolute air superiority to survive the swarms of Allied bombers hunting from overhead. By late 1944, Japan possessed neither the ships nor the fighter planes to even attempt such an operation. Any convoy trying to break out of Simpson Harbor would have been vaporized by American air and naval power before it even cleared the Bismarck Sea. Imamura was trapped in a brilliant, devastating paradox. He possessed tens of thousands of loyal infantrymen, heavily fortified mountains, deeply buried ammunition dumps, and a stable food supply. Yet, he completely lacked the one essential currency of modern war, the capacity to project that power beyond his own shores. A fortress that cannot influence the battlefield outside its walls ceases to be a weapon. By surviving so efficiently in the dark, the Japanese garrison at Rabaul had accidentally built their own perfect prison. They had removed the threat of starvation, only to lock themselves into the most surreal, agonizing psychological standoff of the entire Pacific theater. This surreal standoff created a psychological pressure cooker unlike anything else in the Pacific theater. Inside the subterranean labyrinth, tens of thousands of highly disciplined troops lived in a perpetual state of coiled anticipation. Every single day, they meticulously maintained their air soccer rifles, oiled their machine guns, and checked the damp stockpiles of artillery shells. They tended their volcanic gardens at night, fueled their bodies, and waited in the dark for a glorious apocalyptic final battle that simply never arrived. The officers constantly drilled their men, drilling the martial code into their minds, assuring them that the American invasion fleet was coming, that the ultimate test of their warrior spirit was imminent. They were prepared to die defending the empire, but instead they were forced into a bizarre, mundane routine of farming and hiding. Outside their tunnels, the actual war was moving with terrifying speed, streaking past them and leaving them entirely in its wake. The immense Allied war machine, now a juggernaut of aircraft carriers, battleships, and amphibious assault forces, swept relentlessly toward the Philippines, slicing through Japanese defenses at Leyte Gulf and Luzon. The island-hopping campaign accelerated, pushing toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, drawing closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. The map of the Pacific was rapidly changing color, but Rabaul remained a static, isolated dot far behind the advancing front lines. The massive garrison, fully armed, well-fed, and strategically paralyzed, stared out at empty horizons. They watched the daily bomber runs, absorbed the punishment, and waited for an enemy that had no intention of fighting them on their terms. It was the agonizing reality of a warrior culture completely bypassed, rendered totally irrelevant by the enemy's deliberate strategy. They were trapped in a paradox. They had the strength and the resources to fight a massive battle, but the war had simply moved on without them. The empire they were sworn to defend was collapsing under the weight of the Allied onslaught. Cities were burning, fleets were sinking, and the soldiers of Rabaul could do absolutely nothing but dig deeper, tend their sweet potatoes, and wait for a battle that would never come. This bizarre, agonizing standoff held until the Emperor's broadcast abruptly ended the war, forcing the undefeated Ghost Army to finally emerge from the shadows and face their victors. When the Ghost Army of Rabaul finally walked out of their volcanic tunnels and into the sunlight of September 1945, the Australian forces stepping ashore to accept their surrender were completely unprepared for what they found. They expected to process a broken, manageable remnant of emaciated survivors. But as the formal tallies were handed over and the ranks of soldiers formed up in the cratered ruins, the Allied officers realized they had profoundly miscalculated the reality of the bypassed stronghold. The official ledgers recorded a staggering headcount: exactly 57,368 Japanese Army troops and 31,923 naval personnel, alongside thousands of civilian workers. The Australians weren't just looking at a surviving garrison. They were staring at a highly disciplined population the size of a small city. Instantly, the triumph of victory dissolved into a logistical nightmare. The incoming Australian occupation force was relatively small, vastly outnumbered by the very prisoners they had just defeated. Under the standard rules of war, an occupying army assumes responsibility for housing, feeding, and administering the troops that surrender to them. But absorbing a sudden influx of nearly 100,000 mouths was a physical impossibility for the Australian command. In one of the most striking, overlooked ironies of the Pacific War, the victorious Allies simply could not afford to dismantle their enemy. Faced with a catastrophic administrative burden, the Australians issued a stunning directive. They ordered the Japanese military hierarchy to remain completely intact. General Imamura's staff was told to keep direct command of their men. The defeated Imperial Army was instructed to go out, build its own massive prisoner of war camps, and, most importantly, keep farming. The sprawling agricultural machine that the Japanese had so painstakingly engineered to survive the daily rain of Allied bombs was not dismantled. Instead, the Australians demanded it continue operating at full capacity. The victors forced the Japanese to utilize the exact same self-sufficiency they had developed to defy the blockade, just to sustain themselves as captives. The desperate agricultural system built to resist the Allies had flawlessly transformed into the very tool the Allies used to manage the peace. The ultimate legacy of Rabaul fundamentally rewrites the traditional rules of siege warfare. It proves that a massive army, equipped with deadly weapons, unbroken discipline, and a limitless food supply, becomes utterly meaningless if the conflict simply decides to move around it. General Imamura's men successfully defeated the starvation blockade and survived a relentless rain of high explosives, yet they lost the Pacific without ever firing a shot in its defense. One of the most terrifying military fortresses on the planet was systematically transformed into a self-sustaining prison camp. Its immense human capital was forever erased from the strategic balance, neutralized entirely without a single decisive battle.